Welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Tonight our story begins in a quiet English market town, long before the great stages of London, and long before the name William Shakespeare became known around the world. Imagine a writer so famous that his plays are performed somewhere in the world every single day, in almost every language spoken by human beings. Picture a man who invented or popularized more than 1,700 words still used in English today. Words like lonely, eyeball, bedroom, and swagger. Consider someone whose stories about jealousy, ambition, love, and grief are still made into films, still taught in classrooms, still quoted by people who have never read a word of the original text, 400 years after his death. This is the story of William Shakespeare. And yet here is the strange part. For all his fame, we know remarkably little about the man himself. No diary survives. No letters written in his own hand describing his thoughts have ever been found. We have his signature on a handful of legal documents, spelled differently almost every time. We have baptismal records, marriage licenses, tax complaints, a will that famously left his wife his second best bed. We have the plays themselves, 38 of them, plus sonnets and narrative poems. And from these, generations of scholars have tried to reconstruct the inner life of a man who somehow managed to write more convincingly about the human heart than almost anyone before or since, while revealing almost nothing about his own. How did a glover's son from a market town in the English countryside, with no university education, no aristocratic connections, and no obvious advantages, come to write words that would outlast empires? That is the question we will spend this evening trying to answer, slowly, the way such questions deserve to be answered, not chasing certainty, because so much about this life remains uncertain, but sitting patiently with what can be known and what can only be imagined. But to understand how this happened, we must go back. Back before the plays, before London, before the name Shakespeare meant anything at all. Back to a small town in Warwickshire, England, in the middle of the 16th century, where a boy was about to be born into a world of leather, wool, and quiet ambition. Before we begin, if you find comfort in stories like this one, long, unhurried journeys through the lives of people who shaped our world, consider following along so more of these can find you when you need them. Now, let us settle in and travel back to the England of the 1560s. England in the middle of the 16th century was a country still finding its shape. Henry VIII had died in 1547, leaving behind a kingdom fractured by his break from the Catholic Church, a fracture that would ripple through the next several reigns. His young son Edward VI ruled briefly and died young. Then came Mary, who tried to drag England back to Catholicism through force, and who earned the nickname Bloody Mary for the executions that followed. And then, in 1558, 5 years before our story truly begins, a new queen took the throne, Elizabeth I, 25 years old, Protestant, unmarried, and destined to rule for 45 years. This was the England into which William Shakespeare would be born, a nation settling uneasily into a new religious identity, ruled by a queen whose court would become one of the great centres of art and ambition in European history. It was a country of roughly 3 million people, most of them living in small towns and villages, dependent on agriculture, still largely untouched by the printing presses and playhouses that would soon transform English culture. About 100 miles northwest of London, in the county of Warwickshire, sat a market town called Stratford-upon-Avon. It was not a large place. Perhaps 2,000 people lived there in the 1560s, but it was a place of real substance. The River Avon ran through it, gentle and slow-moving, used for fishing, for washing wool, for turning the wheels of the local mills. The town had a grammar school, a guild chapel, half-timbered houses lining narrow streets, and a busy market square where farmers and tradesmen came to sell wool, grain, leather, and livestock. Into this town, sometime in the early 1550s, a young man named John Shakespeare arrived from the nearby village of Snitterfield, where his father had been a farmer. John was ambitious in the way that many young men of modest birth were ambitious in Tudor England. He wanted to rise. He apprenticed as a glover, learning to work leather into gloves, purses and belts, a respectable trade that required real skill. He also began dealing in wool and in grain and in money lending on the side, activities that were not always strictly legal but that many tradesmen quietly pursued to build capital. John Shakespeare was, by all accounts, a man who understood how to climb. He purchased property. He joined the town council. Eventually he would become an alderman, then a burgess, and in 1568 he would reach the very top of Stratford's civic ladder, serving as bailiff, essentially the mayor of the town, a position that came with the right to be addressed as master and to wear a fur-trimmed robe on ceremonial occasions. It is worth dwelling a little longer on John Shakespeare's character and career, because so much of William's later opportunities depended on the foundation his father built. John Shakespeare had arrived in Stratford with essentially nothing beyond his training as a glover, and through a combination of genuine skill, careful dealing, and evident personal ambition, he built himself into one of the town's most prominent citizens within roughly a decade. Beyond gloving, he traded in wool at a scale that occasionally brought him into conflict with regulations governing the wool trade, and he engaged in money lending, charging interest at rates that technically violated usury laws of the period, though such practices were widespread and only occasionally prosecuted. This willingness to operate at the edges of strict legality in pursuit of advancement, common among ambitious tradesmen of the era, suggests a man of real practical shrewdness, someone unwilling to let rigid rule-following stand in the way of building a more secure life for his family. His civic career, meanwhile, followed a steady and genuinely impressive upward trajectory. He first appears in Stratford records in 1552, fined for having an unauthorised dung heap outside his house on Henley Street, a small, almost comic detail, but one that places him definitively in the town by that date. Within a few years he was serving in minor town offices, ale taster, responsible for checking the quality and pricing of bread and beer sold in the town, then constable, then a fearer, an official responsible for assessing fines, then chamberlain, managing the town's financial accounts. Each of these positions, however modest they might sound to modern ears, represented genuine trust from his fellow townsmen and a rising position within Stratford's tightly structured civic hierarchy. By 1565, the year after William's birth, John had become an alderman, one of the town's senior governing officials, entitling him to wear a distinctive gown marking his status at civic occasions. And in 1568 he reached the top of this ladder entirely, elected bailiff, the chief magistrate and effectively the mayor of Stratford, presiding over the town council, representing Stratford's interests and enjoying the right to be addressed with the honorific Master, a title of real social significance in a hierarchical society where forms of address carried genuine weight. This meant that William Shakespeare spent his earliest childhood years, roughly ages 1 through 4, as the son of the most prominent civic official in his hometown, a formative circumstance whose psychological effects can only be guessed at, but which surely shaped his early sense of his family's place in the world, and perhaps later his evident interest across so many of his plays in questions of legitimate authority, civic duty, and the responsibilities and burdens that come with public office and public reputation. Around 1557, John married a woman named Mary Arden. This was, in the terms of the time, a marriage that moved the family upward. Mary came from an old and respected Warwickshire family. Her father, Robert Arden, was a prosperous farmer who owned substantial land in the village of Wilmcote, just outside Stratford. Mary was his youngest daughter, and when Robert died in 1556, he left her land and money, a meaningful inheritance that made her in effect a woman with real prospects. That a glover's son from Snitterfield married into the Arden family says something about how far John Shakespeare had already climbed by his mid-20s. The house where John and Mary settled, on Henley Street in Stratford, still stands today. It was a substantial home for a tradesman, with the front rooms used as a shop for John's glove-making business, and the family living quarters behind and above. It smelled most likely of tanned leather and wool, and the smoke of a hearth fire that rarely went cold. It would have been a place of constant activity, apprentices working leather, customers coming and going, the sounds of the market square drifting in from outside. Mary Arden gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Joan, in 1558. The baby did not survive infancy, a heartbreak so common in this era that it rarely appears in records except as a name and a burial date. A second daughter, also named Joan, was born in 1562 and also died young. Then, in 1564, Mary was pregnant again. The exact birth date of William Shakespeare is not recorded. Birth dates rarely were in this period. What we do have is a baptismal record from Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, dated the 26th of April, 1564, recording the christening of Gulielmus Filius Johannes Shakespeare, William, son of John Shakespeare. Tradition, based on the customary gap of a few days between birth and baptism, has settled on April 23rd as his likely birthday, a date that carries its own poetry, since April 23rd is also St. George's Day, the feast day of England's patron saint, and, by strange coincidence, the date on which Shakespeare would die 52 years later. The name William was common in the era, unremarkable, chosen perhaps in honour of a relative or simply because it was fashionable. There was no sign, no omen, nothing in the baptismal register to suggest that this particular baby, born to a glover and his wife on a spring day in a Warwickshire market town, would become the most famous writer in the history of the English language. That same year, 1564, the plague arrived in Stratford. It was a deadly summer. Records show that roughly 1 in 7 residents of the town died before the outbreak subsided in the winter. The Shakespeare household remarkably was spared. The infant William survived his first brush with the mortality that claimed so many children of his era. That same year of William's birth also brought the death of 2 of his infant sister's generation of Stratford children to the plague outbreak that swept the town, a reminder of how fragile any single life remained in this era, how easily the story we're telling tonight might never have begun at all. The Shakespeares, having already lost 2 infant daughters before William's birth, would have understood this fragility with an intimacy that is difficult for us, living in an age of modern medicine, to fully imagine. Every child who survived infancy in Tudor England did so against real statistical odds, and the fact that William lived to see his first birthday, then his 5th, then his 10th, was never something his parents could have taken for granted. He grew up on Henley Street, in a household that was, by the standards of the time, comfortable and rising. His father's civic career continued to advance through William's childhood. Bailiff by the time William was 4, a position of genuine local importance. The family would eventually include 8 children in total, though, as was tragically common, not all would survive to adulthood. William was the 3rd child and the eldest son. a position that came with certain expectations in a tradesman's family, that he might, in time, take over the family business, or at least carry forward the family name with some distinction. Consider for a moment what the town itself would have sounded and smelled like on an ordinary morning during William's earliest years. Stratford sat at the crossing of several important roads, so the rumble of cartwheels and the calls of drovers moving livestock toward market would have been constant background noise. The Avon itself moved slowly past the edge of town, its banks lined with willows, its waters used for washing wool fleeces before they went to market, for driving the wheels of grain mills, for fishing that supplemented many households' modest diets. The parish church, Holy Trinity, stood at the edge of town along the river bank, its spire visible from most points in Stratford, its bells marking the hours and the seasons of the religious calendar that still structured daily life even after the upheavals of the Reformation. Henley Street itself, where the Shakespeare household lived and worked, was one of the town's principal streets, lined with timber-framed houses much like their own, some serving as shops on the ground floor with living quarters above, in the pattern typical of English market towns of the period. From the front room of the Henley Street house, passers-by could see John Shakespeare or his apprentices at work on animal hides, stretching and cutting and stitching leather into gloves fine enough for gentlemen and ladies, alongside the simpler leather goods that ordinary townspeople needed. The smell of the tanning and dressing process, sharp and unmistakable, would have been part of the very fabric of William's earlier sensory memories, mixed with the more pleasant smells of the household hearth, bread baking, and the seasonal smells of the market square just a short walk away. Religiously, the household would have conformed, at least outwardly, to the newly established Protestant Church of England, attending services at Holy Trinity as required by law. Yet the England of William's childhood remained a country only one generation removed from Catholicism, and many families, including possibly the Shakespeares themselves, retained private sympathies or practices from the old faith, even while publicly conforming to the new. This tension between public conformity and private belief, a defining feature of Elizabethan religious life, would have been simply part of the atmosphere William breathed growing up. A lesson, perhaps, in the gap that can exist between what people say and what they privately hold to be true, a theme that would echo in countless variations through his mature dramatic work. The world he was born into, then, was not one of poverty, nor one of aristocratic privilege. It was something in between, a solid, striving tradesman's world in a country still settling its religious and political identity, ruled by a queen who would preside over one of the great cultural flowerings in English history. Nobody watching baby William in his cradle on Henley Street could have known what he would become. But the seeds, his father's ambition, his mother's better lineage, the market town's grammar school waiting for him just up the road, were already being planted. Stratford-upon-Avon in the 1560s and 1570s was, for a curious child, a place rich with sensory experience. The market square filled twice weekly with farmers selling grain, wool, and livestock. Travelling merchants passed through on the road between Warwick and Birmingham, and, importantly for young William's development, travelling companies of actors occasionally visited the town, performing in the Guildhall or in inn-yards, sponsored by noble patrons whose names they carried, the Queen's men, the Earl of Leicester's men, and others. As bailiff, John Shakespeare would have had the responsibility of licensing these performances and likely attended them himself, quite possibly bringing his young son along. It is not hard to imagine a boy of 6 or 7, sitting or standing in a crowded hall, watching grown men in costume speak lines of verse, sword fight, weep, and make audiences laugh, and something in him quietly taking note. Formal education for a boy of William's social position would have begun around age 7 at the King's New School, Stratford's Grammar School, located just a short walk from Henley Street. There is no surviving enrolment record. The school's records from this period have not survived, but as the son of a town alderman and later bailiff, William would have been entitled to attend free of charge, and it would have been almost unthinkable for John Shakespeare not to send him. The education offered at an Elizabethan grammar school was rigorous and almost entirely focused on Latin. Boys arrived at 7 in the morning and often did not leave until 5 in the evening, 6 days a week, with lessons built around memorization, translation, and the close study of Roman authors: Ovid, Virgil, Cicero, Seneca, Plautus. Students were drilled in rhetoric, the art of persuasive argument and structured language, and in the techniques of classical poetry and drama. This is worth pausing on, because it matters enormously to what came later. The boy who would grow up to write Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, and the Tempest was trained, from childhood, in the structural bones of Roman storytelling, the 5-act structure, the rhetorical devices, the classical sources that would echo throughout his mature work. Ovid's Metamorphoses in particular left visible fingerprints on Shakespeare's later imagination. Its stories of transformation, love, and tragedy would resurface again and again in his plays. Ben Jonson, a fellow playwright and sometime rival who knew Shakespeare personally, would later write with a mixture of admiration and gentle condescension that Shakespeare had small Latin and less Greek. Given the standard curriculum of an Elizabethan grammar school, this was likely more a comment relative to university-educated writers than an accurate description of Shakespeare's actual schooling, which, if he attended through his early teens as was typical, would have given him a solid grounding in Latin literature and rhetorical technique that shaped his writing for the rest of his life. There is no formal record confirming Shakespeare attended university, and most biographers agree he almost certainly did not. This absence matters. Many of the celebrated playwrights of his generation, Christopher Marlowe most notably, were university wits, Oxford or Cambridge educated men who looked down, at least initially, on the grammar school-educated glover's son from the provinces who dared to write for the London stage. Shakespeare's path to literary greatness ran not through university lecture halls, but through the practical, commercial, collaborative world of professional theatre. This would prove, in time, to be an advantage rather than a limitation. His writing retained an earthiness, an accessibility, a rootedness in ordinary speech and ordinary people that set him apart from more academically polished contemporaries. Around the time William was entering his teenage years, the family's fortunes began to shift. John Shakespeare, once the rising star of Stratford's civic life, began experiencing financial difficulties. Records show him missing council meetings, being fined for various infractions, and eventually losing his position on the town council altogether in the mid-1580s. Some historians believe these troubles were financial, perhaps debts from wool dealing gone wrong, or losses tied to broader economic pressures. Others have speculated, based on circumstantial evidence, that the family may have maintained secret Catholic sympathies during a period when practicing the old faith was dangerous, and that John Shakespeare's absences from official Protestant church attendance, noted in some records, might reflect quiet religious nonconformity rather than simple debt. The truth remains genuinely uncertain, and biographers continue to disagree. What is more certain is the effect on young William. Family tradition, dating back to early biographers who spoke with people who had known the Shakespeares, holds that William was withdrawn from school before completing the full course of grammar education, likely to help with the family's struggling glove business, or simply because the family could no longer justify the loss of his labour. If true, this means William's formal schooling ended somewhere in his early teens. Not unusual for the time, but a departure from the path that might have led toward university and potentially a more conventional literary career as a university-trained poet or clergyman. It is worth imagining for a moment what a typical school day might have felt like for young William. Boys of the King's New School would have gathered before dawn in winter months, walking through Stratford's still dark streets to reach the schoolroom, a long upper chamber above the town's Guildhall, heated inadequately by a single fireplace, lit by whatever daylight came through the windows, and, on the darkest mornings, by candles the boys themselves were sometimes required to provide. Lessons began with prayers, then moved into the relentless work of Latin grammar. Declensions and conjugations drilled through repetition, mistakes punished, in keeping with the pedagogical norms of the age, by the schoolmaster's rod. There was little room in this system for individual creative expression. The goal was mastery of classical language and rhetorical structure through sheer disciplined repetition, a method that would strike most modern educators as harsh, but one that produced, in William Shakespeare's case at least, an almost instinctive command of language's rhythm, structure, and persuasive power that would serve him for the rest of his life. The schoolmasters themselves during Shakespeare's likely years of attendance were, interestingly, men of genuine intellectual accomplishment. Several held degrees from Oxford, an indication that even a small provincial school like Stratford's could attract capable teachers, likely reflecting the town council's investment in education as a mark of civic pride, an investment in which William's own father, as an alderman and later bailiff, would have had a direct hand. This detail matters. The education available to a Stratford tradesman's son in the 1570s, while certainly not equivalent to a university education, was nonetheless considerably more rigorous and more oriented toward genuine literary and rhetorical sophistication than might be assumed of a mere grammar school in a country town. The curriculum itself, closely modelled on humanist educational reforms that had swept through England over the preceding decades, emphasised not merely rote memorisation but active practice in composing original Latin verse and prose, translating passages back and forth between Latin and English in ways designed to build genuine fluency with rhetorical structure and figurative language, skills that map with striking directness onto the sophisticated wordplay, extended metaphor, and rhetorical patterning that would later characterise Shakespeare's mature dramatic verse. Beyond the schoolroom, the England of Shakespeare's childhood was alive with the residue of older traditions gradually giving way to newer ones. Mystery plays and morality plays, medieval dramatic traditions built around biblical stories and moral allegories, were still performed in some parts of the country during his early years, though the practice was fading under Protestant disapproval of what reformers considered superstitious Catholic spectacle. Travelling companies of players, meanwhile, represented the future of English drama, professional, commercial, increasingly secular in subject matter, performing history and comedy and tragedy rather than religious allegory. A boy growing up in Stratford during these particular decades would have stood, without knowing it, at a genuine hinge point in the history of the English theatre, absorbing the last echoes of one dramatic tradition while the seeds of an entirely new one were being planted around him. The gap in the historical record that follows, roughly from his early teens until his early 20s, is the single largest mystery in Shakespeare's biography. Scholars have nicknamed it the Lost Years, and into this gap, generations of biographers and amateur theorists have poured every kind of speculation. That he worked as a schoolteacher in the countryside, that he trained as a lawyer's clerk, that he joined a travelling theatre company, that he fled Stratford after being caught poaching deer on a local nobleman's estate. None of these theories has ever been proven. What we do know with certainty is what happened next in his personal life. In November 1582, at the age of 18, William Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway, a woman 8 years his senior, from the nearby village of Shottery. The marriage bond survives, along with evidence that it was arranged with some urgency. The couple was permitted only a single reading of the marriage banns instead of the usual 3, a sign that speed mattered. The likely reason becomes clear from the record of their first child, a daughter named Susanna, baptized in May 1583, roughly 6 months after the wedding. Anne was already pregnant when they married. This detail deserves to be held gently rather than judged. Premarital pregnancy followed by marriage was not uncommon in Elizabethan England, particularly among couples who had already exchanged a formal betrothal, which carried real social and sometimes legal weight even before the church ceremony. What we cannot know, and what biographers have debated for centuries without resolution, is the emotional texture of the marriage itself, whether it began in genuine affection, in obligation, in some combination of both. Shakespeare's plays are filled with marriages both blissful and troubled, and readers across the centuries have searched them, probably in vain, for clues about his own domestic life. Less than 2 years later, in February 1585, Anne gave birth to twins, a son, Hamlet, and a daughter, Judith, named after close family friends in Stratford, Hamlet, and Judith Sadler. William Shakespeare was 20 years old, married, and the father of 3 children, all before he had, so far as the historical record shows, written a single line that survives today. It is worth taking each of the major lost years theories seriously enough to understand why they have proven so tempting to generations of biographers, even without proof. One theory, first proposed by an 18th century antiquarian and repeated ever since despite thin evidentiary support, holds that Shakespeare fled Stratford after being caught poaching deer from the estate of a local landowner, Sir Thomas Lucy, and facing prosecution, or at least serious local trouble as a result. Some early biographers connected this legend to the unflattering portrait of a pompous justice named Shallow, who appears in Shakespeare's later plays, speculating that Shallow was a satirical dig at Lucy written years afterward. The story is engaging, but no contemporary document supports it, and most modern scholars treat it as folklore rather than history. A second theory, sometimes called the Lancashire hypothesis, proposes that young William spent part of these years employed as a tutor or schoolmaster in a Catholic household in Lancashire, in the north of England, based on a will from that period mentioning a servant named William Shakeshaft, a name close enough to Shakespeare's to have generated genuine scholarly interest, combined with the documented connection between that Lancashire family and the Stratford schoolmaster who may have taught young William. If accurate, this theory would suggest Shakespeare's family maintained genuine Catholic connections, and that William himself may have spent time within recusant Catholic circles before establishing himself in the London theatre world, a theory that remains actively debated by serious scholars rather than dismissed as mere folklore, though it too falls short of definitive proof. A third and more mundane possibility, favoured by many biographers simply because it requires the least speculation, is that Shakespeare spent these years in relatively unremarkable fashion, perhaps assisting with his father's declining business in Stratford, perhaps working intermittently for a local attorney, or in some other capacity that left behind no distinctive record, gradually building whatever connections eventually led him toward London and the theatrical profession, without any single dramatic turning point or crisis prompting the move, A fourth possibility worth mentioning, favoured by some scholars who emphasise the sheer practical demands of supporting a growing family, suggests that Shakespeare may have spent at least part of these years travelling with one of the touring theatrical companies that regularly passed through Warwickshire, gradually working his way toward London through provincial performance circuits, gaining hands-on experience in the actual mechanics of stagecraft long before any documented London appearance. This theory has the advantage of explaining, more naturally than sudden arrival as an unknown, how a man with no prior recorded theatrical connections could appear in London by the early 1590s, already possessing the practical skills to write convincingly for the stage, understand company dynamics, and hold his own against university-educated rivals. Whichever explanation comes closest to the truth, the fact remains that we simply do not know, and this uncertainty has proven, across the centuries, endlessly generative for biographers, novelists and filmmakers eager to fill the gap with their own imaginative reconstructions. What we can say with confidence is only this: whatever happened during these years, whatever combination of hardship, wandering, self-education, and quiet preparation filled them, they produced, by their end, a writer equipped with the tools to succeed almost immediately upon reaching London's competitive theatrical marketplace. And then, once again, the record falls silent. From 1585 until 1592, we have almost nothing documenting where William Shakespeare was or what he was doing. He simply disappears from Stratford's records and does not reappear until he surfaces quite suddenly in London, not as an obscure newcomer, but already established enough to be attacked, by name, by a jealous rival playwright. Whatever happened during those lost years, however he learned the craft, made his connections, found his way to London's theatrical world, by 1592 William Shakespeare had arrived, and the world was about to notice. London in the early 1590s was a city of roughly 200,000 people, sprawling, filthy, vibrant, dangerous, and utterly unlike the quiet market town of Stratford. It was a city of narrow streets, timber-framed buildings leaning toward each other overhead, the stench of the Thames mixing with wood smoke and the cries of street vendors. It was also, crucially, a city in the middle of a theatrical revolution. Public playhouses were a genuinely new phenomenon in English life. The first purpose-built commercial theatre, simply called the Theatre, had opened only in 1576 in the northern suburbs of London, just beyond the reach of the city authorities who generally disapproved of playgoing. By the time Shakespeare arrived, several more had followed, along with a thriving culture of professional acting companies, playwrights working for hire, and audiences numbering in the thousands who would pay a penny to stand in the open yard, or more for a seat, to watch new plays performed almost every afternoon. For a young man with no university education and no established family in the theatre business, breaking into this world required both talent and grinding persistence. We do not know exactly how Shakespeare made his entry, whether as an actor first, working his way up through minor roles, or as a jobbing writer, revising and patching other men's scripts, the way many playwrights of the era began. What we do know is that by 1592 he had made enough of a mark to provoke jealousy. That year, a playwright named Robert Greene, dying in poverty and bitterness, published a pamphlet warning his fellow university-educated writers about an upstart actor who had dared to write plays of his own. Greene described this newcomer as an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, accusing him of thinking himself the only shake scene in a country. The pun on Shakespeare's name makes clear who Greene meant, and the insult itself is oddly valuable to us. It tells us that by 1592, William Shakespeare was already successful enough and threatening enough to established writers to be worth attacking in print. Whatever happened during the lost years, he had not wasted them. But 1592 also brought devastation of a different kind. The plague, that recurring terror of Elizabethan urban life, swept through London with such severity that the authorities closed the public theatres entirely, on and off, for roughly 2 years. For a young writer just beginning to establish himself in a theatrical career, this closure was a genuine crisis. Theatres were his livelihood, and with them shuttered, an entire profession was suddenly without its stage. Shakespeare's response to this forced pause reveals something important about his resourcefulness. Rather than simply waiting idle, he turned to a different literary form entirely: narrative poetry, written for a wealthy patron rather than a paying public audience. In 1593 he published Venus and Adonis, a long, sensuous poem based on classical mythology, dedicated to Henry Wriothesley, the young Earl of Southampton. The following year came a second narrative poem, The Rape of Lucrece, also dedicated to Southampton. Both poems were commercially successful. Venus and Adonis in particular went through numerous printings during Shakespeare's lifetime, making it, by some measures, his most popular published work while he was alive. This period also likely produced many of Shakespeare's sonnets, though their exact dating remains uncertain and debated among scholars. A sequence of 154 poems that would not be published together until 1609, exploring love, beauty, mortality, jealousy, and desire with an intimacy that has fascinated and puzzled readers for centuries, not least because scholars still debate the identities of the young man and the dark lady, who appear as recurring figures within them. Consider what it meant to be 29 years old, already a husband and father of 3, already the target of a dying rival's jealousy, and suddenly cut off from the one profession you had worked so hard to enter. Consider the uncertainty of not knowing, week to week, whether the theatres would reopen at all, or whether the plague sweeping through London's crowded parishes might claim you next, the way it claimed so many thousands of ordinary Londoners that year. It would have been entirely reasonable in that moment to lose faith in the whole enterprise, to consider returning to Stratford permanently, to the safer, more predictable trade of gloves and wool that his father had built. He did not. Instead, he picked up a different kind of pen and kept working, adapting to circumstances he could not control, waiting for the moment when the doors of the playhouses would open again. The relationship with Southampton, whatever its precise nature, mattered enormously to Shakespeare's early career. Patronage was the lifeblood of Elizabethan literary ambition. A well-placed noble patron could provide not just money, but access, protection, and reputation. Some biographers have speculated that Shakespeare's fondness for Southampton, expressed in the dedications with unusual warmth for the era, may connect to the emotionally intense sonnets addressed to a beautiful young man, though this remains, like so much else in Shakespeare's biography, informed speculation rather than settled fact. Year after year, through the plague closures of the early 1590s, Shakespeare kept working, writing poetry when the stage was closed, and, we believe, continuing to draft and revise plays for whenever the theatres might reopen. By the time they did, in 1594, he was ready with something that would define the rest of his career, not just a play, but a professional partnership. In 1594, Shakespeare became a founding member and shareholder of a new theatrical company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, formed under the patronage of Henry Carey, Lord Chamberlain, one of the most powerful men at Elizabeth's court. This was a genuinely significant moment, and it distinguishes Shakespeare's career from that of almost every other playwright of his generation. Most Elizabethan dramatists, Marlowe, Greene, Kidd and others, were freelancers, selling individual plays to whichever company would pay for them, dependent entirely on their pens for income, often living precariously from commission to commission. Shakespeare instead became a shareholder, an actual business partner with a financial stake in the company's success, entitled to a portion of the profits from every performance, not just payment for scripts. This arrangement meant that Shakespeare's fortunes were tied directly to the health of his company, and it gave him an incentive and likely a creative freedom that few of his contemporaries enjoyed. He wrote not as a hired hand delivering scripts to be reshaped by others, but as a company insider, writing plays specifically for the particular actors he worked alongside every day, understanding their strengths, shaping roles to fit voices and bodies he knew intimately. Chief among these was Richard Burbage, the company's leading tragedian, for whom Shakespeare would eventually write Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. By age 30, still relatively young by the standards of established literary reputation, Shakespeare had achieved something remarkable: financial security through shared ownership of a successful theatrical enterprise, a growing reputation as both poet and playwright, and the beginning of what would become one of the most productive creative partnerships in theatrical history. An ensemble of actors who would premiere nearly every major play he ever wrote. The years of struggle, the uncertain lost years, the plague closures, the jealous attacks from established writers, had given way to something sturdier. Lesser spirits, arriving in London with no connections and no university pedigree, might have given up and returned to the family glove business in Stratford. William Shakespeare had not given up. He had instead quietly built the foundation for everything that followed. Before we move forward into the great flowering of Shakespeare's career, it is worth pausing to consider what his daily life during these London years might have actually looked like, because the man behind the plays remains, even now, frustratingly hard to picture in ordinary detail. Unlike many writers of his era, Shakespeare left behind no personal letters describing his routines, his opinions, his friendships, or his private thoughts. What we know comes instead from scattered legal documents, tax records, the recollections of contemporaries recorded years or decades later, and inferences drawn from the plays themselves, a method that requires real caution, since a playwright who can convincingly voice murderers, kings, jealous husbands, and grieving fathers cannot be assumed to share the opinions of any single character he created. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: Shakespeare appears to have lived a life divided between two places. He worked in London, where the theatres were, renting lodgings in various parts of the city over the years. Records place him in the parish of St Helens, Bishopsgate, in the mid-1590s, and later south of the river near the Globe Theatre itself. But his family, Anne and his children, remained in Stratford-upon-Avon throughout. This was not entirely unusual for the period. London was expensive, plague-ridden, and often considered unsuitable for raising a family, and many successful men maintained households elsewhere while working in the capital. But it does mean that for much of his most productive adult life, Shakespeare was, by necessity, often apart from his wife and children, returning to Stratford periodically, rather than living with them day to day. Contemporary descriptions of Shakespeare the man are frustratingly sparse. The most vivid comes from Ben Jonson, writing years after Shakespeare's death, who described him as having an excellent fantasy, brave notions and gentle expressions, someone whose wit was in his own power, and whose writing flowed with such natural ease that his fellow actors reportedly said he never blotted out a line, meaning he rarely revised his first drafts, a claim Jonson found somewhat exasperating, dryly remarking that he wished Shakespeare had blotted 1,000. Physically, we have only the evidence of 2 posthumous images generally accepted as reasonably accurate likenesses: the engraving by Martin Droeshout that appears on the title page of the first folio, published in 1623, and the funerary bust in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford. Both show a man with a high forehead, a receding hairline, a moustache, and a generally unremarkable, somewhat stern countenance, though scholars caution that neither image was created from life, and both likely involved some artistic convention rather than precise portraiture. As for personality, we are left largely to infer. The plays themselves suggest a mind of extraordinary range, capable of bawdy comedy and profound philosophical meditation within the same scene, capable of writing convincingly from the perspective of kings and clowns, young lovers and bitter old men, virtuous women and calculating villains. This range has led many readers, across the centuries, to feel that Shakespeare somehow contained all of humanity within himself, while remaining as a private individual curiously absent from his own text, a quality the poet John Keats would later famously call negative capability, the capacity to inhabit contradictory perspectives without imposing a fixed personal viewpoint. We know he was sociable enough to be remembered fondly by fellow actors and writers, sharing drinks, by later legend, with Ben Jonson at the Mermaid Tavern, though the specific anecdotes about their wit combats were recorded decades after the fact and may be more legend than history. We know he was shrewd about money. The tax and legal records that survive show a man steadily acquiring property, lending money, pursuing debts owed to him through the courts, and investing his theatrical earnings into real estate back in Stratford. This financial carefulness sits alongside the poetic imagination in an interesting tension. The same man who wrote some of the most transcendent language in English literary history was also, quite plainly, a careful and successful businessman who understood contracts, shares, and property law. We know too that grief visited him in the middle of this productive period. In August 1596, his only son, Hamlet, died in Stratford at the age of 11. The cause is not recorded. Shakespeare was, so far as we know, in London at the time working on his plays. Some scholars have looked for the shadow of this loss in the plays that followed, pointing, for instance, to the grieving mother in King John, written around this period, who cries out about the empty space left by a lost child in language of unusual rawness, or, more speculatively, to the deep meditations on mortality and lost sons and daughters that would recur throughout his later tragedies and romances. Whether these readings are accurate or simply the natural human impulse to search an artist's work for the shape of his sorrows, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that Shakespeare, like nearly every parent of his era, experienced the death of a child and continued in the months and years that followed to write. By the late 1590s, his financial success allowed him to make a gesture that mattered enormously to a man whose own father had once lost social standing. In 1596, he successfully petitioned for a coat of arms on behalf of his father, John, officially elevating the Shakespeare family to the rank of gentleman, a status symbol that meant William himself could now be addressed for the rest of his life as William Shakespeare, gentleman. In 1597, he purchased New Place, one of the largest houses in Stratford, a substantial brick and timber residence with extensive gardens, a clear public statement that the glover's son from Henley Street had not only succeeded in London, but had returned, at least symbolically, in triumph. It is worth trying to picture, with appropriate humility about how much remains speculative, an ordinary working day for Shakespeare during these productive London years. He likely rose early, as was the general custom of the age, in his rented lodgings, modest rooms rather than anything grand, since even a successful shareholder in a theatrical company lived without the luxury that would come, for many professionals, only later in life. The working day of an Elizabethan theatre company began with rehearsal, since with as many as 30 or more different plays in a company's active repertory at any given time, actors needed constant practice to keep multiple roles fresh in memory, since Elizabethan theatre did not operate on the modern model of a single production running for months. Instead, companies performed a different play from their repertory nearly every afternoon, meaning an actor might play Hamlet on Monday, a role in an entirely different tragedy on Tuesday, and a comic role on Wednesday, all while a new work was simultaneously being rehearsed for its upcoming premiere. Afternoons were given to performance itself, typically beginning around 2 o'clock and running roughly 2 to 3 hours, time to conclude before the light faded, since the open-air Globe and similar theatres depended entirely on natural daylight. Shakespeare, in addition to writing, is believed to have continued performing minor roles himself for at least part of his career. Tradition holds that he played the ghost in Hamlet and the elderly retainer Adam in As You Like It, though as with so much else, this rests on later testimony rather than contemporary documentation. Evenings might have brought the kind of sociability later legend most associates with Shakespeare. Gatherings at taverns near the theatre district, conversation and drink shared with fellow actors, writers, and the various hangers-on of London's theatrical world. The Mermaid Tavern on Bread Street became associated in later literary memory with a supposed club of wits, including Shakespeare, Johnson, and other writers of the era, exchanging conversation sharp enough that later writers imagined their evenings there as legendary displays of verbal combat. How much of this is accurate reporting and how much is later romantic embellishment remains genuinely unclear, but it captures something plausible about the collegial, competitive, densely interconnected professional world in which Shakespeare worked. A relatively small community of writers, actors, and theatre managers who knew each other well, borrowed from and competed with each other constantly, and shared, whatever their individual rivalries, a common trade in an art form still working out its own rules and possibilities. Shakespeare's business dealings during these years reveal a man attentive to opportunity well beyond the theatre itself. Records show him purchasing substantial grain holdings in Stratford, investing in a share of the parish tithes, essentially buying the right to a portion of the local agricultural taxes, a genuinely lucrative and shrewd investment for a man with capital to deploy, and pursuing small legal claims through the courts for debts owed to him, showing no particular reluctance about using the law to protect even modest sums of money. This careful, sometimes almost fussy attention to financial detail sits in an interesting and very human contrast against the boundless imaginative sweep of the plays themselves, a reminder that great artists are rarely only their art. They are also, quite often, ordinary people managing ordinary concerns about money, property, and family security, doing so alongside work that would eventually be considered among the highest achievements of human creative expression. This, then, was the daily texture of his middle years, a divided life between London's theatrical ferment and Stratford's quieter domesticity, a careful business mind alongside a boundless creative one, private grief carried alongside professional achievement, and a public reputation steadily rising even as the private man remained, by his own apparent design or simply by the accident of history, almost entirely hidden from view. The years between roughly 1595 and 1608 represent the extraordinary centre of Shakespeare's creative life, a period of such sustained productivity and quality that it remains even now difficult to fully comprehend. During these years, working as the principal playwright for the Lord Chamberlain's men, renamed the King's Men after 1603, when the company came under the direct patronage of the new King James I, Shakespeare produced most of the plays on which his reputation rests. It is worth understanding how Elizabethan playwriting actually worked, because it differs considerably from modern notions of the solitary literary genius. Plays were written quickly, often within weeks, to meet the constant demand of a company that needed new material to keep audiences returning. Shakespeare wrote for actors he knew personally, tailoring roles to their specific talents. Comic parts for Will Kemp and later Robert Armin, tragic leads for Richard Burbage. He drew his plots in almost every case from existing sources, English and Roman history, Italian novellas, earlier plays, classical mythology, reworking familiar stories into something new rather than inventing entirely original narratives, which was standard and unremarkable practice for the era, rather than any kind of plagiarism as we would understand the term today. The scope of what he produced during these years is genuinely staggering. Consider the history plays, tracing the turbulent 15th century struggle for the English crown across multiple works. Richard II, the two parts of Henry IV and Henry V, culminating in one of the most celebrated speeches in the English language, the King's rallying cry before the Battle of Agincourt, still quoted by leaders and remembered by audiences 4 centuries later. Consider first the history plays a little longer, since they represented Shakespeare's earliest sustained achievement and reveal something important about his developing craft. Taken together, the sequence of plays covering the Wars of the Roses and the reigns of Richard II through Henry V amounts to something like a single, vast, dramatic epic in multiple installments, tracing nearly a century of English political turbulence, usurpation, civil war, the burdens and temptations of kingship, and the gradual restoration of stable rule. Through the character of Prince Hal, who appears as a wayward young man carousing in taverns with the disreputable but endlessly charming Falstaff, before transforming into the resolute warrior King Henry V, Shakespeare traced an arc of personal and political maturation that audiences found irresistibly compelling, and Falstaff himself, fat, cowardly, endlessly witty, and deeply beloved despite his obvious moral failings, became one of the most popular characters of the entire Elizabethan stage. So popular that tradition holds Queen Elizabeth herself requested a play showing him in love, supposedly prompting the composition of The Merry Wives of Windsor. Consider the comedies of this same period, A Midsummer Night's Dream, with its interwoven plots of lovers, fairies, and bumbling craftsmen, Much Ado About Nothing, with its sparkling verbal combat between Beatrice and Benedick, Twelfth Night, with its shipwrecked twins and cross-dressing disguises, As You Like It, set in the pastoral forest of Arden, a name that surely echoed for Shakespeare his own mother's family. And then, beginning around 1599 and deepening through the early 1600s, came the great tragedies that would come to define, for many readers, the very pinnacle of his achievement. Julius Caesar, exploring political ambition and betrayal. Hamlet, perhaps the single most analysed work of literature in the English language, a play about a prince paralysed between thought and action, haunted by his father's ghost, wrestling with grief, revenge, and the terrifying possibility that existence itself might be meaningless. A work so psychologically penetrating that it essentially invented a new kind of interior consciousness for dramatic literature. Othello, a devastating study of jealousy and manipulation. King Lear, arguably his darkest and most philosophically uncompromising work, following an aging king's descent into madness and clarity after dividing his kingdom based on flattery rather than love. Macbeth, a compressed, nightmarish study of ambition and guilt. It is worth sitting a little longer with Hamlet specifically, since its impact on the development of Western literature is difficult to overstate. The basic story, a prince commanded by his father's ghost to avenge a murder, was not original to Shakespeare. Revenge tragedy was an established and popular genre on the Elizabethan stage, and an earlier play on similar material, now lost, is believed to have existed before Shakespeare's version. What Shakespeare did with this familiar dramatic framework, however, was something genuinely new. Rather than simply having his hero pursue revenge in the expected manner of the genre, he gave Hamlet an interior life of such complexity that the character seems almost to resist the very plot he inhabits, delaying, questioning, doubting, turning his grief and rage inward into extended meditations on existence, action, and meaning that had no real precedent in earlier drama. The famous soliloquy beginning "to be or not to be" is not, on close examination, actually about revenge at all. It is a meditation on whether existence itself, given its inevitable suffering, is preferable to non-existence, a philosophical question of startling scope to find at the centre of what was, commercially, popular entertainment for a paying public audience. This quality of interiority, showing a mind actually thinking, doubting, and changing in real time before an audience, extended across the other great tragedies of this period in different forms. Othello traces, with almost unbearable psychological precision, exactly how a fundamentally decent and loving man can be manipulated, through carefully seeded doubt and circumstantial suggestion, into destroying the person he loves most. The audience watches Iago's manipulation work not through crude trickery, but through a devastatingly accurate portrait of how jealousy, once planted, distorts a mind's interpretation of everything it subsequently perceives. King Lear pushes even further into philosophical bleakness, following an old king who divides his kingdom based on flattering speeches rather than genuine love, and who is then stripped, piece by piece, of everything that had defined his identity, his throne, his followers, his shelter, his sanity, until he is left, in one of the most devastating scenes in all of drama, howling on a storm-battered heath, finally seeing clearly, in madness, truths he had been blind to while sane and powerful. Macbeth, by contrast, compresses its tragic arc into something tighter and more claustrophobic. A soldier of genuine honour and courage who, prompted by prophecy and his wife's ambition, murders his way to a throne he cannot enjoy, haunted from the moment of his first crime by a guilt that poisons every subsequent action and relationship, until his own destruction feels less like external punishment than the inevitable unfolding of psychological rot that began with a single terrible choice. Contemporary references suggest the play was considered unusually intense, even by the standards of an audience already well accustomed to stage violence, and a persistent theatrical superstition, still observed by actors today, holds that even speaking the play's title aloud inside a theatre invites misfortune, a superstition whose origins are murky, but whose persistence, across 4 centuries, testifies to something about the play's unusually potent and unsettling atmosphere. In 1599, the Lord Chamberlain's men opened the Globe Theatre on the south bank of the Thames, built partly from the timbers of the earlier theatre, dismantled and transported across the river. Shakespeare, as a shareholder in this new venture as well as the company, had a direct financial stake in the Globe's success, and many of his greatest plays premiered on its stage, a large open-air amphitheatre capable of holding up to 3,000 spectators, from wealthy patrons in covered galleries to groundlings who paid a single penny to stand in the open yard before the stage. The initial reception of these works varied. Some, like Hamlet, appear to have been popular successes from early on, quickly printed in quarto editions to meet public demand for the text. Others took longer to be recognised for their full achievement. What is clear, across contemporary references, is that by the early 1600s, Shakespeare was widely regarded as the leading dramatist of his generation, not without rivals, particularly Ben Jonson, whose more classically disciplined and satirical style offered a genuine alternative vision of what English drama could be, but Shakespeare's popular and commercial success remained largely unmatched. What made these plays revolutionary, beyond their sheer craft, was something harder to name precisely but easy to feel: an unprecedented psychological depth. Characters before Shakespeare's era in English drama had often functioned as types: the villain, the fool, the wronged wife, driven by relatively simple, legible motivations. Shakespeare's great characters think on stage, in real time, changing their minds, contradicting themselves, revealing depths of self-doubt and self-deception that feel, even now, startlingly modern. Hamlet's soliloquies do not simply announce his intentions. They show a mind actually struggling in real time with the impossibility of certain knowledge and the terror of mortality. This quality, showing thought itself as a dramatic event rather than simply showing action, may be Shakespeare's single most significant innovation, and it is a large part of why his characters continue to feel alive to readers and audiences centuries after the historical and cultural context that produced them has faded from common knowledge. It is worth lingering for a moment on how differently these plays were experienced by their original audiences compared to how we encounter them today. There were no programs, no advance reviews, no established critical tradition telling audiences that Hamlet was a masterpiece before they walked into the Globe. A groundling paying his single penny to stand in the open yard on a given afternoon in 1601 had no idea he was about to witness what later centuries would consider one of the towering achievements of world literature. He simply knew that the Lord Chamberlain's men had a new play, that Richard Burbage was playing the lead, and that an afternoon's entertainment awaited him, weather permitting, in the open air with several thousand fellow Londoners pressed around him. The plays were, first and always, popular entertainment, competing directly for audience attention and admission money against bear-baiting arenas, other theatrical companies, and the general distractions of London life. This commercial pressure shaped the work in ways worth appreciating rather than regretting. Shakespeare wrote plays that had to hold the attention of restless, diverse crowds, mixing high philosophical speech with low comedy, murder with music, tragedy with the kind of bawdy joke that could make a tired apprentice laugh after a long day's work. This is part of why the plays have endured so persistently. They were built, from the ground up, to genuinely entertain, not merely to instruct or impress, and that entertaining quality has travelled remarkably well across 4 centuries of changing tastes. Consider, too, the sheer physical stamina the job demanded. As a shareholder, and for at least part of his career, an actor as well as a writer, Shakespeare would have been involved in nearly every aspect of his company's operation, rehearsing new plays while performing old ones in repertory, sometimes staging a different play every single afternoon of the working week, managing the business affairs of the company alongside his fellow shareholders, and continuing to produce roughly 2 new plays a year throughout this most productive stretch of his career. There was no leisurely creative process of years spent polishing a single work. There was instead the relentless, disciplined rhythm of a working theatre company that needed fresh material constantly, and Shakespeare met that demand not by working apparently and slower and more damaged than his peers, but by producing an almost unbroken sequence of enduring masterpieces under exactly the kind of commercial pressure that might have crushed a lesser talent into mere competence. By any reasonable measure, William Shakespeare, sometime in his late 30s and early 40s, had achieved what few writers in any era achieve. Not merely success, but a body of work that would fundamentally reshape the possibilities of an entire art form. Shakespeare's career unfolded during a period when English political and religious life remained genuinely dangerous, and the theatre, despite its popularity, was never entirely free from suspicion or risk. The most direct brush with political danger connected to Shakespeare's company came in February 1601, when a group of supporters of the Earl of Essex, planning an ill-fated rebellion against Queen Elizabeth, paid the Lord Chamberlain's men to stage a special performance of Richard II, a play depicting the deposition of an English king, on the eve of their attempted uprising. The conspirators apparently hoped the performance would stir public sympathy for their cause by drawing parallels between the deposed Richard II and their grievances against Elizabeth's rule. The rebellion failed swiftly and badly. Essex was arrested and executed for treason within weeks. Shakespeare's company was questioned by the authorities about the performance, but was ultimately cleared of any deliberate involvement in the plot, the players successfully arguing they had simply been paid to perform an existing, previously licensed play without knowledge of the conspirators' intentions. Consider the position Shakespeare's fellow shareholders found themselves in during those tense weeks following the failed rebellion. The Earl of Essex had once been among the most celebrated and powerful men in England, a court favourite whose fall from grace unfolded rapidly and disastrously across the final months of 1600 and into early 1601. His supporters, growing desperate as his position collapsed, turned to theatre as a form of propaganda, believing that a public reminder of a monarch's deposition might stir sympathy for their own grievances against Elizabeth. That the Lord Chamberlain's men agreed to stage the requested performance of Richard II, apparently for a payment considerably above their usual fee, suggests either genuine ignorance of the conspirators' intentions, as they later claimed, or at minimum, a willingness to overlook suspicious circumstances in exchange for money, a decision that could easily have proven catastrophic had the authorities judged the company's involvement more harshly. Several of the actual conspirators were executed in the aftermath, including Essex himself, beheaded within the Tower of London less than 3 weeks after the failed uprising. That Shakespeare's company escaped this affair with nothing worse than an official inquiry represents, by the standards of the age, a genuinely fortunate outcome, and a vivid reminder of how easily the theatrical profession he had built his life around could have been derailed by forces entirely outside his control. It was nonetheless a genuinely dangerous moment. Treason accusations in Elizabethan England carried the possibility of imprisonment, torture, and execution, and Shakespeare's proximity to it, however incidental, is a reminder that the theatrical world he inhabited was never entirely separate from the political dangers of the age. Religious tension also touched his world, if more distantly. England during Shakespeare's lifetime remained divided between the officially established Protestant Church and a persecuted Catholic minority, and the threat of Catholic conspiracy against the crown was real and repeatedly acted upon by the authorities, most dramatically in the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, when a group of Catholic conspirators attempted to blow up Parliament and King James. Some biographers have speculated, based on circumstantial family connections and possible references within the plays, that Shakespeare's own family, particularly his father, may have retained private Catholic sympathies. If true, and it remains genuinely uncertain, this would have required Shakespeare to navigate his professional and public life with considerable care, since open Catholic sympathy could carry serious legal and social consequences. More directly documented is the sustained professional rivalry, sometimes sharp-edged, that characterised London's competitive theatrical marketplace. Ben Jonson, brilliant and combative, occasionally aimed pointed criticism at Shakespeare's more relaxed attitude toward the classical unities of drama and his willingness to mix comedy with tragedy in ways that stricter classicists considered undisciplined. This rivalry, however, appears to have coexisted with genuine mutual respect. Jonson's later tribute to Shakespeare, written for the first folio after Shakespeare's death, calling him not of an age but for all time, suggests that whatever professional friction existed between them during their lifetimes, it never curdled into lasting enmity. Perhaps the most persistent shadow across Shakespeare's professional life, recurring again and again like an unwelcome refrain, was not human rivalry but disease. The plague closed London's theatres repeatedly throughout his career. In the early 1590s, again severely in 1603 upon Elizabeth's death and James's accession, and again in various years afterward. Each closure meant lost income for the company, and genuine uncertainty about when, or whether, normal theatrical life would resume. Shakespeare lived his entire working life under this recurring threat, a reminder that even the most celebrated career of the age was built within conditions of real and constant vulnerability. There is also the quieter, more diffuse danger that shadowed every writer of the period: censorship. All plays performed publicly in Elizabethan and Jacobean England required the approval of an official called the Master of the Revels, who could and did demand changes to scripts he considered politically sensitive, religiously inflammatory, or insulting to the crown or to powerful nobles. Shakespeare's history plays, dealing as they did with the deposition and murder of English kings, walked a careful line throughout his career, and it is worth remembering that Richard II's abdication scene was, for some years, actually omitted from printed editions of the play, apparently considered too politically delicate for wide circulation, while Elizabeth, herself sensitive to any parallel between her own reign and that of a deposed monarch, remained on the throne. Working as a playwright in this environment required not just artistic talent, but genuine political judgment, knowing which subjects could be safely explored and how, and which required careful indirection, allegory, or historical distance to render safe for public performance. The change of monarch in 1603, when James I succeeded the childless Elizabeth, brought both opportunity and fresh uncertainty. James was, fortunately for Shakespeare's company, a genuine enthusiast of theatre, and one of his first acts as king was to take the Lord Chamberlain's men under his own direct patronage, renaming them the King's Men, and granting them a status and royal protection considerably greater than they had enjoyed under Elizabeth. This was, on balance, enormously beneficial to Shakespeare's career and finances, but it also meant performing more frequently before the court itself, under far closer royal scrutiny, where any misstep in a play's content or perceived political implications carried consequences reaching to the very top of English government. It should be said plainly that Shakespeare's life, compared to many of his contemporaries, was relatively free of the most dramatic personal dangers of the era. Christopher Marlowe, his great early rival, was killed in a tavern brawl under mysterious and possibly politically motivated circumstances in 1593, at only 29 years old. Ben Jonson himself was imprisoned more than once narrowly escaping execution after killing a fellow actor in a duel. Against this backdrop, Shakespeare's career appears notably free of personal scandal or violent incident, the record showing instead a man who navigated the genuine political and professional dangers of his age with evident caution, prospering steadily while others around him met more turbulent fates. By the middle years of King James's reign, In his mid to late 40s, William Shakespeare's creative pace began, gradually and gently, to slow. This was not decline in the sense of failing powers. The plays of this final period, roughly 1608 through 1613, include some of his most formally daring and emotionally serene work, but rather a shift in both output and apparent priorities as a man who had spent decades dividing his time between London and Stratford began, increasingly, to favour home. The late plays, Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale and The Tempest, along with a final collaborative history play, Henry VIII, and the tragicomedy The Two Noble Kinsmen, written with a younger collaborator, John Fletcher, belong to a category scholars often call the romances. These works share a distinctive tone quite different from the great tragedies of the preceding decade. They deal in loss and reconciliation, rather than loss and destruction, in fathers reunited with lost daughters, in seemingly dead characters restored to life, in forgiveness offered after grievous wrongs. The Winter's Tale, in particular, ends with a statue of a wronged queen, believed dead for 16 years, seeming to come to life before her repentant husband's eyes. A moment of theatrical magic that many readers have found almost unbearably moving, and one that feels, in retrospect, like the work of a writer increasingly interested in mercy, restoration, and peace, rather than tragic inevitability. The Tempest, likely written around 1610 or 1611, has long been read by generations of critics and audiences, whether accurately or not, as something like Shakespeare's own farewell to his art. Its central figure, Prospero, a powerful magician exiled to a remote island, ultimately renounces his magical powers in a speech of quiet, resonant finality. He breaks his staff, drowns his books, and prepares to leave the island and return to ordinary life. Whether or not Shakespeare consciously intended this as a personal statement, and many modern scholars caution against reading it too literally as autobiography, since Shakespeare continued working, in some capacity, after The Tempest was completed. The emotional resonance of an aging artist's most famous character choosing to lay down extraordinary power and return home has proven, across centuries, almost impossible for readers not to feel as personally significant. Sometime around 1610, after decades of maintaining a household divided between London and Stratford, Shakespeare appears to have retired substantially, though not completely, from active theatrical life, settling more permanently into New Place, the grand house he had purchased in Stratford years before. He continued some collaborative work. Henry VIII and The Two Noble Kinsmen both date from around 1613, written jointly with John Fletcher, who would succeed him as the King's Men's principal playwright, but the relentless annual output of the previous 2 decades gradually ceased. Life in Stratford during these final years would have been quieter, though not without its own significant events. In June 1613, during a performance of Henry VIII at the Globe Theatre, a cannon fired for a special effect ignited the thatched roof, and the theatre that has been home to so many of Shakespeare's greatest triumphs burned to the ground within about an hour. Remarkably, no one was seriously injured. Contemporary accounts mention only a man whose burning breeches were extinguished with a bottle of ale. But the physical heart of Shakespeare's professional life, the wooden O that had housed Hamlet, Lear, and so many others, was gone. The Globe was rebuilt within a year, with a tile roof this time, but Shakespeare himself by this point was largely settled in Stratford and likely not directly involved in the rebuilding. His personal life in these final years included both satisfaction and sorrow, as personal lives generally do, and the 2 daughters who had survived him into adulthood followed quite different paths that likely brought their father varying measures of pride and worry. His elder daughter, Susanna, had married a respected local physician, John Hall, in 1607, and their daughter, Elizabeth, Shakespeare's only grandchild to survive infancy, was born in 1608, bringing presumably real joy to a grandfather settling into the quieter rhythms of provincial life. His younger daughter, Judith, married rather more troublingly, in February 1616, to a local vintner named Thomas Quiney, whose own conduct, he was found, shortly after the wedding, to have fathered a child with another woman who had since died in childbirth, brought a measure of scandal and evident distress into the Shakespeare household during the final months of William's life. It was during this period, in the early months of 1616, that Shakespeare's health began to decline. We do not know the specific cause with certainty. No detailed medical account survives, though a persistent, though unverified, later tradition, recorded decades afterward by a Stratford vicar, held that Shakespeare fell ill after an evening of drinking with Ben Jonson and fellow poet Michael Drayton. Most modern biographers treat this story with considerable scepticism, as it was recorded long after the fact and bears the hallmarks of a local legend rather than reliable testimony. What we do have is more concrete. In January 1616, Shakespeare had his will drawn up, revised again in March of that year, suggesting that he and those around him understood his health was failing and his time was likely limited. The will itself is a remarkably detailed document, carefully distributing property, money and possessions among his family, his fellow actors, and various friends, including the famous bequest to his wife Anne of his second-best bed with the furniture, a line that has fascinated and puzzled readers for centuries. Some have read it as a slight, evidence of a cold or estranged marriage. Others point out that under the era's inheritance laws, Anne was already entitled to a portion of the estate regardless of the will's specific wording, and that the second-best bed was very possibly the couple's actual marital bed, the best bed in a household often being reserved for guests, making the bequest a gesture of genuine intimacy rather than dismissal. We cannot know for certain which reading is correct, and this ambiguity, so characteristic of everything we know about Shakespeare's private life, remains unresolved. The bulk of his estate, New Place, his other properties, and the majority of his considerable wealth passed to Susanna, reflecting both the era's customs of primogeniture and, perhaps, practical trust in her and her husband's judgment. He also left money for mourning rings to be purchased for several of his fellow actors and long-time colleagues in the King's Men, including Richard Burbage, John Heminges, and Henry Condell, a detail of quiet significance, since it was Heminges and Condell who would, 7 years later, take on the enormous task of collecting and publishing Shakespeare's plays in the volume now known as the First Folio, an act of devotion to a departed friend and colleague to which every subsequent generation of readers owes an incalculable debt. Consider what it must have meant in practical terms for a man in his mid-40s, still at the height of his creative powers by any objective measure, to begin deliberately stepping back from the profession that had defined his adult life. There is no dramatic account of a farewell performance, no recorded speech to his fellow shareholders announcing his retirement. The transition appears instead to have happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, the way many genuine life transitions do. Fewer new plays each year, more time spent in Stratford, more of the company's day-to-day business handled by younger partners, until at some point, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, William Shakespeare had simply become primarily a Stratford gentleman who had once written plays in London, rather than a London playwright who occasionally visited his family in the country. Life at New Place during these years would have carried a different rhythm entirely from the crowded, competitive, deadline-driven world of the London theatre. Stratford remained, as it had been in his childhood, a market town organised around agricultural cycles, local governance, and the practical concerns of property and trade. Concerns Shakespeare understood intimately, both from his father's earlier civic career and from his own decades of careful investment in local land, grain, and tithes. He would have been, by this point, one of the town's most substantial property owners, a figure of genuine local standing, entitled to move in Stratford's respectable social circles among fellow gentlemen, merchants, and professionals like his son-in-law, the physician John Hall. There is a persistent and appealing tradition, though like so much else in Shakespeare's biography impossible to verify with certainty, that he maintained friendships and correspondence with figures back in London even after his retirement, and that visitors from the theatrical world occasionally made the journey to Stratford to see him. Whether or not specific stories about such visits are accurate, it seems entirely plausible that a man who had spent decades at the very centre of London's most vibrant artistic community would not have severed those connections entirely simply by changing his primary residence. The illness that eventually claimed his life in early 1616 arrived, so far as the fragmentary record allows us to understand, with enough advance warning that Shakespeare had time to attend carefully to his affairs, revising his will not once but twice within a short span, a detail suggesting either a fluctuating condition or simply the ordinary caution of a careful man wanting to be certain every provision was correctly stated before it was too late to make further changes. The specific language of the will, with its detailed and sometimes idiosyncratic instructions, down to bequests of specific items of furniture and small sums of money to servants and friends, paints a portrait of a mind that remained clear and attentive even as the body was failing, a man determined to leave nothing to chance or ambiguity in how his considerable estate would be distributed among the people who mattered most to him. Through these final months, as his body weakened, Shakespeare's character, so far as the sparse record allows us to see it, appears to have remained steady, attentive to practical matters, concerned for his family's future, quietly settling his affairs with the same careful, business-like attention he had brought to property purchases and theatrical shares throughout his working life. There is no record of despair, no dramatic final gesture, only the quiet, methodical work of a man putting his house in order. William Shakespeare died on the 23rd of April 1616 at his home, New Place, in Stratford-upon-Avon. He was 52 years old. The precise circumstances of his final hours were not recorded by anyone close to him, and no deathbed account survives. A silence entirely consistent with the pattern of his entire life, in which the private man remained, again and again, just beyond the reach of the historical record. We do not know his last words, if he spoke any of particular significance. We do not know exactly who was present in the room, though we can reasonably assume his wife Anne and his daughter Susanna, both still living in Stratford at the time, were nearby. What we do know is that the date carries its own quiet symmetry. April 23rd, the same date traditionally assigned to his birth 52 years earlier, and the feast day of St. George, England's patron saint, a small, poetic coincidence that Shakespeare himself, the master of dramatic timing, might have appreciated, though of course no one can say whether it is entirely accurate, since his actual birth date was never formally recorded, only inferred from his baptism 3 days later. 2 days after his death, on the 25th of April 1616, William Shakespeare was buried inside Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, the same church where he'd been baptized 52 years before. Burial within the church itself, rather than in the churchyard outside, was a mark of the social standing he had achieved during his lifetime. a privilege granted to him partly as a landowner and tithe-holder in the parish, a final quiet testament to how far the glover's son from Henley Street had risen. His grave is marked by a flat stone bearing an epitaph, believed to have been composed by Shakespeare himself, that has become almost as famous as anything else he wrote. "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Whether Shakespeare wrote these lines specifically to deter the common practice of the era, in which older graves were sometimes disturbed to make room for new burials, or whether they carried some other private meaning, we cannot know for certain. What is true is that the warning worked. In the 4 centuries since, despite enormous scholarly and popular curiosity about the man buried beneath that stone, his grave has never been opened. His epitaph's curse apparently respected even by generations of researchers who might otherwise have longed for one more piece of physical evidence about the mysterious life it commemorates. Above the grave, mounted on the church wall, sits the funerary monument commissioned by his family sometime in the years following his death, a carved half-figure of Shakespeare, pen in hand, gazing out over the church, accompanied by a Latin inscription praising his wisdom and comparing him, in his artistry, to Socrates in judgment and Virgil in genius. Alongside it, in English verse, the monument declares that all that he has written leaves living art behind, to serve his wit. Consider, too, what Stratford itself would have looked like on the day of that burial, in late April of 1616. The town he had left decades earlier as a young man with an uncertain future had, by this point, come to know him as something quite different. A successful gentleman, a substantial property owner, the man who had purchased and restored New Place, one of the finest houses in the borough. Word of his death would have moved quickly through the tight-knit community, and the burial itself taking place within the walls of Holy Trinity Church, rather than in the more ordinary churchyard ground outside, would have been understood by everyone present as a mark of genuine civic and social distinction, even if no elaborate record survives describing exactly who attended or what words were spoken over the grave. His wife Anne would outlive him by 7 years, dying in 1623 at the age of 67, the very same year that Heminges and Condell published the first folio, meaning she lived just long enough, potentially, to see the beginning of her husband's transformation from a respected but retired Stratford gentleman into something considerably larger in the public imagination, though we have no record of her reaction to the volume, if she ever saw or heard of it at all. She was buried beside him in Holy Trinity Church, her own memorial inscription noting that she'd given her breast, milk and life to him. Tender language, whatever the true emotional texture of their marriage may have been across the 34 years they spent often apart as husband and wife. Their daughter Susanna would live on for many more years afterward, dying in 1649, remembered on her own gravestone as a woman wise to salvation, while their granddaughter Elizabeth, the last direct descendant of William Shakespeare, would die childless in 1670, quietly closing the bloodline of the family that had once produced the most celebrated writer in the English language, though the words he left behind required no descendants to carry them forward into the centuries that followed. No detailed record survives of the funeral itself, who attended, what was said, how the town of Stratford marked the passing of its most famous son. In London, where the theatrical world he'd helped transform continued without him, there is likewise no surviving account of any immediate public tribute at the moment of his death, a silence that would only be filled, meaningfully, 7 years later, when his former colleagues finally gave the world the gift that would ensure his words, whatever became of his bones, would never truly rest. In the immediate aftermath of Shakespeare's death there was, so far as the record shows, no great public outpouring of grief beyond his immediate circle. He had already been retired from active theatrical life for several years by 1616, and the London stage had, in the meantime, embraced newer voices. Ben Jonson remained active and celebrated, and John Fletcher had assumed Shakespeare's former role as the King's Men's principal playwright. For a time, it might have seemed entirely possible that William Shakespeare would be remembered, if at all, as one accomplished playwright among several talented contemporaries, his individual plays gradually fading from performance as theatrical fashion shifted, the way so many works by his fellow Elizabethan and Jacobean dramatists eventually did. That this did not happen is due, in very large part, to a single act of devotion by two of his closest theatrical colleagues. In 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, John Heminges and Henry Condell, longtime fellow actors and shareholders in the King's Men, published a collected volume of his plays now known as the First Folio. This was in itself a remarkable undertaking. Collected volumes of contemporary playwrights' works were unusual for the period, since plays were often regarded as ephemeral popular entertainment rather than serious literature worthy of preservation in expensive printed volumes. Heminges and Condell gathered together 36 plays, working from a combination of Shakespeare's own manuscripts where available, and the prompt books and other performance materials held by the company. Crucially, 18 of these plays, including Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night, and The Tempest, had never before been published in any form. Without the First Folio, these works, some of the most celebrated in the entire history of literature, would very likely have been lost entirely, existing today only as titles mentioned in passing historical records, their actual words gone forever. The folio's preface included Ben Jonson's now famous tribute, in which the poet, whatever professional friction had existed between them in life, declared Shakespeare to be not of an age, but for all time, a phrase that has proven, across the subsequent 4 centuries, to be almost eerily prophetic. The rise of Shakespeare's posthumous reputation was not, however, instant or uninterrupted. During the mid-17th century, England's theatres were closed entirely for nearly 2 decades under Puritan rule, and when they reopened after the Restoration in 1660, Shakespeare's plays were frequently altered, sometimes quite drastically, to suit the changed tastes of the era. King Lear, remarkably, was performed for much of the 17th and 18th centuries in a revised version with a happy ending, in which Cordelia survives and Lear is restored to his throne, audiences of the period apparently finding the original's bleak conclusion too unbearable to stage. It was really during the 18th century that Shakespeare's reputation began to consolidate into something like its modern form, propelled substantially by the actor and theatre manager David Garrick, whose enormously popular productions and public celebrations, including a large Shakespeare Jubilee held in Stratford in 1769, helped cement Shakespeare's status as England's national poet. The Romantic movement of the early 19th century, with its emphasis on individual genius and psychological depth, found in Shakespeare an almost perfect ancestor, and critics of that era, along with the German Romantics who were equally enthusiastic, helped establish the interpretive traditions of close psychological reading that continue to shape how Shakespeare is studied and discussed today. Consider, too, the specific and remarkable case of the King James Bible, published in 1611, near the very end of Shakespeare's active career, and translated by a committee of scholars working under royal commission. Though no credible evidence connects Shakespeare directly to the translation itself, the King James Bible and Shakespeare's collected works together form the twin pillars upon which so much of subsequent English prose style would be built. their rhythms and vocabulary absorbed by centuries of English language writers who grew up reading both, often side by side, as the two central texts of their literary education. Together, these two bodies of work, one a sacred translation produced by anonymous scholarly committee, the other the collected imaginative output of a single provincial playwright, did more to shape the sound and shape of modern English than perhaps any other source. The specific mechanics of Shakespeare's linguistic inventiveness are worth pausing over, because they reveal something genuine about how his creative mind worked. He frequently took existing words and simply used them in new grammatical forms, turning nouns into verbs, for instance, in ways that felt startling to his contemporary audiences, but that have since become entirely unremarkable features of ordinary English. When a character in Shakespeare says someone has been out-villained by another, or that grief has uncled a young prince, he is demonstrating a kind of linguistic playfulness and flexibility that expanded the expressive possibilities of the language itself, treating English not as a fixed system of rules, but as living material that could be reshaped, compressed, and extended to capture increasingly precise shades of feeling and meaning. This linguistic legacy persists in ways most speakers of English never consciously register. Someone describing a business rival's plan as having backfired is unknowingly invoking a metaphor that first appears in recognizable form in Shakespeare's work. Someone telling a friend not to stand on ceremony is using a phrase Shakespeare gave to the English language. A teacher warning a student that brevity is the soul of wit is quoting Polonius from Hamlet, usually without any awareness that the words originated with a garrulous, rather foolish character whose own speech is, pointedly, anything but brief. A small irony that captures something of Shakespeare's characteristic wit, embedding a phrase about concision inside one of the most long-winded speeches in the entire play. By the 20th and 21st centuries, Shakespeare's influence had expanded far beyond the theatrical world into something closer to a permanent fixture of global culture. His plays have been translated into every major world language and performed on every inhabited continent. They have been adapted into hundreds of films, from lavish period productions to radical reimaginings that transplant his stories into entirely different times and settings. West Side Story, reworking Romeo and Juliet on the streets of 1950s. New York, Akira Kurosawa's Ran reimagining King Lear in feudal Japan. Countless film versions of Hamlet spanning nearly the entire history of cinema itself. His influence on the English language is difficult to overstate and impossible to fully calculate. Scholars estimate that Shakespeare either coined or was the first recorded user of somewhere between 1,700 and 2,000 English words, including bedazzled, lonely, generous, gloomy, critical, and eyeball. Beyond individual words, entire phrases woven so thoroughly into everyday English speech that most people using them have no idea of their origin, trace directly back to his plays. Break the Ice, Wild Goose Chase, In a Pickle, Heart of Gold, Wear Your Heart on Your Sleeve, Vanish into Thin Air, The World's Mine Oyster. A person speaking modern English fluently is, in a very real sense, speaking a language substantially shaped by a glover's son from Warwickshire. In the field of psychology and literary criticism, Shakespeare's characters, Hamlet's paralysing self-consciousness, Lear's shattering confrontation with his own mortality and folly, Macbeth's corrosive guilt, Iago's unexplained malevolence, have provided a vocabulary and a set of case studies that continue to shape how writers and thinkers discuss human motivation and moral complexity. Centuries before formal psychology existed as an academic discipline, Sigmund Freud, in developing psychoanalysis, drew repeatedly and explicitly on Hamlet in formulating some of his own theories about unconscious motivation and repressed desire. Modern neuroscience and cognitive research have even, in recent decades, turned to Shakespeare's language as a subject of study in its own right, with researchers examining how the brain responds differently to his unusual grammatical constructions and inventive word combinations compared to more conventional prose, finding measurable increases in cognitive engagement when readers encounter his characteristic linguistic surprises. A scientific footnote that would likely have amused a man who worked entirely by instinct and craft rather than any theory of psychology, yet whose sentences continue, centuries later, to reveal genuine complexity under the most rigorous modern scrutiny available. In everyday modern life, encounters with Shakespeare's legacy are almost impossible to avoid entirely, whether or not one is aware of them. In the countless towns, schools, theatres, and streets that bear his name across the English-speaking world and beyond, in the annual festivals, most famously at Stratford-upon-Avon itself, where the Royal Shakespeare Company continues to perform his works in the town of his birth, in the classrooms where his plays remain, nearly universally, a fixture of secondary and university education across dozens of countries, in the countless everyday phrases people use without a second thought about their 400-year-old origins. Consider too Shakespeare's peculiar and enduring influence on how other writers have understood their own craft. Across the centuries, an extraordinary range of authors, working in languages and cultures Shakespeare could never have imagined, have returned to his plays as a kind of touchstone. Herman Melville, writing Moby Dick in 19th century America, read Shakespeare's tragedies obsessively while composing his own novel of monomaniacal obsession, and traces of Lear's and Ahab's rhetoric visibly echo one another. Leo Tolstoy, late in his life, wrote a lengthy and famously harsh critique of Shakespeare, finding his work morally confused and overrated, and yet the very fact that one of the towering novelists of the 19th century felt compelled to write an entire essay refuting Shakespeare's reputation testifies to how inescapable that reputation had become. Composers from Giuseppe Verdi, who based 3 operas on Shakespeare's plays, to modern film composers scoring yet another adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, have found in his stories source material seemingly inexhaustible after 400 years of continuous use. In the world of law and government, Shakespeare's plays have been cited, quoted and referenced by judges, politicians and legal scholars grappling with questions of justice, mercy and power. Portia's speech on the quality of mercy in The Merchant of Venice remains one of the most frequently quoted passages on the nature of justice in the English legal tradition, still cited in courtrooms and legal writing today. Winston Churchill, during the darkest years of the Second World War, drew on Shakespeare's history plays and their portraits of English resilience and national identity in shaping his own wartime rhetoric, understanding instinctively how deeply embedded Shakespeare's language had become in the English sense of collective identity and purpose. Even the scientific world has in its own way paid tribute. Astronomers naming the moons of Uranus turned to Shakespeare's plays for inspiration, so that today the planet's largest satellites bear names like Titania, Oberon, Miranda, Ariel, and Puck, meaning that somewhere in the night sky, quite literally, pieces of Shakespeare's imagination now orbit permanently through the solar system. A strange and rather beautiful afterlife for a glover's son who once watched travelling players perform in a market town guild hall. There have, inevitably, been controversies and revised opinions across the centuries of Shakespeare scholarship. Debates about authorship, given the relative scarcity of biographical documentation, have periodically produced theories suggesting that other figures, such as Francis Bacon, or Christopher Marlowe or Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, might have actually written the plays attributed to the Stratford Glover's son. The overwhelming consensus among Shakespeare scholars remains that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon was indeed the author of the works bearing his name, supported by the substantial contemporary documentary evidence connecting him directly to the London theatrical world, his fellow actors' testimony, and the specific textual evidence within the plays themselves. But the persistence of these authorship debates, however thoroughly refuted by mainstream scholarship, speaks to something genuinely remarkable. The gap between the ordinary, sparsely documented life of the historical man and the almost unimaginable scale of his literary achievement continues, even now, to strike people as somehow implausible, a testament in its own strange way to just how extraordinary that achievement truly was. We began this evening with a question. How did a glover's son from a small market town, with no university education and no aristocratic advantages, come to write words that would outlast empires? Having travelled through his life together, we're left, honestly, without a complete answer. The lost years remain lost. The private man remains, in so many ways, private still, hidden behind legal documents and second-hand recollections, and the vast, overwhelming presence of his own creative work. We know his business dealings better than we know his heart. We know the outline of his days better than the texture of his thoughts. And yet, perhaps this is fitting, Shakespeare himself, through the words he gave to Prospero in one of his final plays, seemed to understand something about the fleeting, dreamlike nature of any single human life, however remarkable. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. He wrote constantly about the persistence of memory and reputation beyond the boundaries of a single mortal life. In his sonnets, he promised the young man he addressed that, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. A promise made about poetry's power to outlast flesh, spoken by a man who, whether he fully knew it or not, was making that same promise about himself. Consider, one final time, the strange and instructive gap between the ordinary facts of this particular life and the scale of what it produced. There was no obvious sign in the baptismal register at Holy Trinity Church in 1564 that this particular infant would be different from any other child born that year to a tradesman and his wife. There was nothing in the grammar school records, had they survived, that would have marked him out clearly from his classmates enduring the same Latin drills and the same rod-enforced discipline. There was nothing, so far as we can tell, in the circumstances of his early marriage or his uncertain early years in London that announced the arrival of a genius. He simply worked, steadily, year after year, play after play, learning his craft in the practical, collaborative, commercially pressured environment of a working theatre company, absorbing influence from classical sources and popular tradition alike, and slowly, without any single dramatic turning point that his contemporaries seem to have recognized as historically significant, he became the writer whose words we still return to, sleepless or otherwise, 4 centuries later. There is something quietly consoling in this, perhaps, for anyone listening tonight who has ever wondered whether an ordinary life, built through ordinary daily effort rather than any singular flash of destiny, could ever amount to something lasting. William Shakespeare's life, examined closely, was made of exactly this kind of ordinary material. A tradesman father's civic ambitions, a grammar school education completed or not completed, an early marriage entered under uncertain circumstances, years of quiet, undocumented labour, and then decades of steady, disciplined, commercially pressured work, play after play, deadline after deadline, grief carried alongside triumph, financial caution, alongside boundless imagination. Out of this thoroughly unremarkable set of circumstances came words that continue, against every reasonable expectation, to feel utterly alive. He was right in the end, in a way that even he perhaps could not have fully anticipated. The house on Henley Street still stands. The grave in Holy Trinity Church still bears its quiet warning, undisturbed after 4 centuries. And somewhere, tonight, in a theatre or a classroom or a quiet reader's hands, someone is encountering for the first time or the 100th the words of a man born in 1564 to a glover and his wife in a market town beside the river Avon. Words about love and jealousy, ambition and mercy, grief and forgiveness that continue to feel, against every reasonable expectation of time's erosion, entirely alive. That is perhaps the truest legacy any human being could hope to leave behind. Not perfect knowledge of who they were, but the persistent, undiminished feeling that they somehow understood exactly who we are. Thank you for spending this time with the story of William Shakespeare. If it brought you some comfort or eased you gently towards sleep, consider following along for more stories like this one, told slowly, the way a good story deserves to be told. Until next time, rest well. Good night.